I'm going to bring our panel up onto the stage. We're going to have a kind of final session of reflection, and I'm going to begin with your opinions about some things. But let me welcome back to the stage Lord David Willits, Dr. Barbara Ginelli, Dr. Tim Moonan, and Douglas Cuff from IQHQ. Douglas, if you're here, please come and join us on the stage. Great to have you. Let's give them another round of applause. Now, while they're collecting their thoughts, because a lot of this is going to be about what have we learnt today, let me find out what you've learnt today or what you already knew. So I'm going to ask you 6 questions. I'm going to tell you, first of all, that these are very binary questions. It's all yes or no. And the second thing to tell you is the cameras are off. Nobody is spotting how you vote. So, question number 1. Do you know now, as a result of being here all day, what a scientific superpower is? If you do, raise your hands. Yes, please. Let's see you. Okay. No, please. Let's see the no's. Okay. I'm going to call that as 90 plays 10 on yes versus no. Second question. Can the UK be a scientific superpower? If you think yes, let's see you, please. Okay. If you think no, let's see you. I'm going to give that a 98 plays 2. Question number 3, a little bit more subtle now. Should the UK try to be a scientific superpower? If you think yes, raise your hands. Okay, if you think no, please raise your hands. That's 100 plays 0, so we're in Cuba now, or maybe we're in Australia. Now, question number 4. Are we already doing what is required to become a scientific superpower? Are we already doing it? If you think yes, raise your hands. Aha! If you think no, raise your hands. As I told you, there's only binary choice. Okay, that's 3 plays 97. So we know what it is. We think we should do it, but we're not already doing it by the looks of things. 97 versus 3 say no. Okay, question number 5. Is it clear that success in the Oxfam arc or the Golden Triangle, whichever version of this you like, is it clear that success in that would contribute to the UK as a whole becoming a scientific superpower? If you think yes, raise your hands. Okay, if you think no, raise your hands. Okay, names and addresses, please, of those. It's a very interesting question in this audience, because if I asked that question in Glasgow or Manchester, I would get a different answer, I suspect, to the one we've just got. But I'm calling that as 94 plays 6. 94% of you think it can. Question number 6. Can we become a scientific superpower and also level up the United Kingdom? If you think yes, please raise your hands. If you think no, please raise your hands. Okay, I'm giving that 95 plays 5. So an interesting set of answers there. Thank you very much. The big answer, panel, I think, is that we all know what it is. We all know that we should do it, but we're not doing it. So why are we not doing it? David, your remarks, I think, were brilliant in that regard. Your 6 imperatives for the nation as a whole. Now, for the panel, I've got a few questions for them, but my questions are not as good as your questions. So the way I'd like to do this is I do have Slido on, and it is open on the right page, and so far nobody's sent a question, as far as I can tell. So we will have a chance for you to ask your questions hands up. That would be great. But let me just ask our panelists first to reflect on the votes. So we know what a scientific superpower is. We believe that a scientific superpower in the Oxfam arc can help us level up. We believe it will help the whole of the UK. But we're not doing what we need to do. Douglas, do you agree we're not doing what we need to do? And what's the thing we're not doing?
Well, it's hard. You know, the reason I'm not doing it is because it's difficult to do. If it was easy, everyone would do it. That's my first takeaway. I think when I look at it, and obviously I'm American and spent a significant time in Boston, and I look at what Boston has done and where they focus a lot of their time and energy is to create a superpower, scientific superpower. And they have, from a demand generator perspective, they have Harvard and MIT. Well, Cambridge has Cambridge, Oxford has Oxford. But what I've seen in my 20 plus years in Boston is big investment into infrastructure on multiple levels. So the first one was the Big Dig, which they essentially took a highway, went right through the central artery of the city and put it underground, redid the infrastructure, new subways, did a tunnel through the Boston Harbor so you connect the airport to the east-west corridor. $15 billion, 20 plus years. Some would say a complete disaster, but the city's beautiful now because of it.
Are you proposing this project, the equivalent of the Big Dig, for either Oxford or...
I'm thinking my takeaway is going to be you need to think big.
Yeah.
My takeaway, so you beat me to my punch. The second one was Deval Patrick, when he was governor, he started the Life Science $1 billion fund. 50% of that went into infrastructure, which was not only hard infrastructure, but skills development for not only the researchers, but the lab technicians, the people actually doing the science at the bench side. Then 25% went into tax incentives for companies, and the last 25% went into investing into companies, to actually investing in the companies to grow them. And then the last tranche was a $500 million investment from Mayor Menino, who invested into developing the waterfront, which is now anchored by Vertex. That's where Vertex headquarters is. And he built a new light rail that went through there and put all the infrastructure in to do that. And because of that, that part of town has now exploded. And it's beautiful. Before it used to be docks and tons of crime and parking lots, and now it's a place to go to. And so I think making those big bets and investing infrastructure-wise, going big, has really catapulted it to Boston where it is today, which then kind of accelerated all the other growth that's going on now.
Douglas, thank you very much. Let me ask you a quick follow-up question that, in a way, focusing on the Boston and Massachusetts case study is very interesting. But of course, what you had there was a city that was already a big city that had been a former industrial power and a maritime power. It had an appetite for a new future for Boston and its environs. In the places in the UK where the innovation economy has as it were, flourished most quickly, perhaps there's been a lower history of appetite for its own growth. Do you think there's something unique about either the UK or about Massachusetts that helped to illuminate your point?
And not to offend any of the universities, but profit is a bad word. It was a bad word here. That pendulum has swung the other way. I think in Harvard and particularly MIT, it was the first university that started to invest in research done that could be commercialized. So you're right, that kind of generated it and kept going. Now, within the last, I've been involved with Cambridge for about the last 10 years. That pendulum has now swung. Cambridge was probably ahead of it. Oxford's now behind it. And then you see UCL, Imperial, and King's. They've woken up and said, why is my brethren, why is their endowment so huge? It's because they allowed their researchers to not only do their postdoc work, but also start commercial ventures.
Right, very, very helpful. And perhaps there are people in the room who want to talk about Glasgow, Manchester, Cardiff, Bristol, Newcastle, and other places as well. Barbara, when you saw the vote where everybody said, we know what it is, we know that we should do it, we know, that it's achievable, but we're not doing it. What do you think is the thing that they think we're not doing?
I think probably we need to actually share more of what we're doing and make people aware of what is the art of the possible.
Do you think we're doing it, but they don't know?
Some of it. I don't think we're doing it all. Let me be clear on that. But I think that we've gone a long way since we started at least a decade ago in Harvard. When I started talking about clusters, I always had very blank looks. And people were saying, well, why do we need clusters? What do you mean? We've got the facilities, that's it, and there is some collaboration already going with industry. Well, actually, that instead, the development of clusters has been what has energized that engagement with industry, has attracted inward investment. As I mentioned before, I think 40% of our investment into the campus is from inward investors, and that is actually growing more and more across all the sectors. So I think that we're doing something well. We're doing something that is demonstrating growth. We've got something very unique, in my view, as well in the UK, because I've traveled around the world to, for example, visit space clusters around the world. But the Howard Space Cluster is the only cluster where we've got such a concentration of space companies at a walking distance from each other. And actually, they've also got a unique concentration of capabilities that is accessible to them. That's not something you find elsewhere in the world. And to go back to the question, how we do it, are we doing everything we can? I don't think so, because we still need to connect things together better. We're talking about leveling up, but in my view, investments have to have a clear strategy behind it, which is an overarching strategy across the country, whereby you make an investment, you connect things together so that you can leverage what is already within the country, so that you build on the complementarities and on the synergies. And that's where then people in the room would probably come back with a different answer, because they would know more of what's available and how to actually collaborate better. So that's, in my view, that's the key.
Okay, so I'm going to summarize what I think you just said in a minute. But Douglas's view was that, firstly, it's difficult, and secondly, you've got to think big. Your view was actually we've got to make what's already happening more visible so that people have confidence in it and they understand it. And also we've got to coordinate it better, I think is what you're saying. A kind of leadership deficit, perhaps. We'll come back to that. David, if we may, I'm going to come back to you last, because you've already set out 6 points here. But Tim, when you look around the world and you look at the places that have done the kinds of things that are described here by becoming a scientific superpower, what do you think is the ingredient that might be missing in the UK from what you observe abroad?
I think there are 3 things, Greg. And they all begin with C. One is capacity. I think we heard the Boston story there, the magnitude of difference between what Oxford and Cambridge are able and trying to do versus what Boston has done, for worse as well as better, is absolutely stark, and therefore there's a big question about where and how to grow capacity within the wider orbits of those places. Secondly, I think there's a big question about connectivity. If you're not going to have the capacity locally, how do you connect it to the wider regions or to the north and the Midlands and beyond? We have a deficit, I think most people would perceive, in terms of how connected these places are to other places, both within a sort of a travel distance to work, but also more broadly.
This is music, of course, to the ears of the chair of the Connected Places. Thank you very much. Yep.
And the third one, I think, is complementarity. I still think there's an element to which people are unsure where is supposed to be good at what, and in what sense does one thing enable and support something else, and that's both within the arc and across the arc, not between Oxford and Cambridge, but also between the Golden Triangle and the rest of the UK, in what sense they reinforce each other. I think those are the 3 gaps that I would look to.
So there's a perception missing of the win-win, the complementarity, but you've made the point. Capacity, connectivity, complementarity, you said. Thank you, Tim. Now, David, you've probably been thinking about this more than anybody else in the country for the last couple of decades, and you set out your 6 imperatives, which I carefully wrote down. Which of them do you think is the most pernicious or the most difficult? What's the big thing that we might be missing, or is it just a question of time? Because you were very optimistic in what you said.
I think that there's looking at it from this perspective, after all, we're sitting in Westminster. There's the policy cycle around pure upstream versus bridging the valley of death, and government being more activist and engaged in downstream stuff. And this is where, setting aside all the wider controversy about Boris as PM, this is where he is unambiguously clear that there's a role for government. And I thought events such as buying the stake in OneWeb, because he could see there was a strategic gain. There are not going to be many LEO constellations in the world. We had in OneWeb an opportunity to be the leading non-American constellation, and he went for it. I think those type of decisions mean that we have a window when there's less inhibition in government about getting hands-on and engaged. I think that's an advantage at the moment. Obviously Brexit and then the issues around association with Horizon Europe are a big source of uncertainty for the community and anxiety. And if we want to be global, it's a great pity about what's happening. But as I said there, I think when you look at the thinking about Plan B, if we don't associate with Horizon Europe, there's quite a lot of creative thinking going into that. So those are kind of, so for various reasons, there is a bit of a window of opportunity. And anybody here who's I think there's a very live debate going on at the moment about if we don't associate with Horizon Europe, what else do we do with the money? And through the organisations that people here are involved with, because these are decisions that are going to have to be taken in a very tight timescale. This is spend in the current year. This is a moment for people who have got smart ideas and things that need to be done now. In the old language I used to use with George Osborne, shovel ready. This is something where we could spend money usefully now in a technology or an area of development. There happens to be, again, another little window of opportunity that through whatever organisations you're involved in, you should be communicating what you think those options are.
Thank you, David. I'm going to just stay with you for a moment, if I may, and say if Douglas said the issue is you've got to think big and it's difficult, and Barbara said, actually, we're doing a lot of this already, but we're not communicating well, and Tim said, actually, the complementarity between the different parts of the UK is not clear and visible. Do you agree with any of those points?
Well, I think they're all fair points. I mean, for me, I thought the most interesting and challenging response in that fantastic audience participation questions was so many people here think that the success of the ARC is good for levelling up and the rest of the economy. And I have to say, that is not an argument which the ARC has won. Absolutely not. And what has to be done to persuade the wider country that the dynamism of Oxford and Harwell and Cambridge is good for running? That is a battle that still has to be fought. Now, again, I'm trying to link sometimes what we're doing on space on science with space more particularly. So in space, we talk explicitly about a spine that goes from Goon Hilly in Cornwall through Guildford and Harwell and Leicester, and then up to Glasgow as well. So there's something that is, and what I suspect is a weakness for Oxford and Cambridge is I don't sense that they're very good at partnerships with complementary universities or research institutes outside the ARC. Anything that showed that this was of benefit to the offshore wind cluster in Hull and the Humber, or was relevant to the compound semiconductor cluster in South Wales, and complemented what they were trying to do in places like that, I think would really help win people over. But I don't think that is sensed at the moment.
Great, David, thank you very much indeed. That's a very challenging and very good point. Now, questions that you'd like to raise with the panelists. You were promised the opportunity to do this. Now's your moment. Do we have a microphone in the room? We do. So, panelists, if you agree, what I'd like to do is try to elicit from the room 4 or 5 points, and then you pick a couple each that you're interested in, yeah? Can we do it that way? So you're first, sir. You're going to be second. You don't have to be male to ask a question, by the way, but you're first, sir.
Andrew Ross from Global Garden. It's for David. You mentioned the role of government is to take on risk, to leverage in private sector capital. Today, there has not been a single mention of green finance, nor about sustainability, nor about net zero commitment, and nothing at all about how the Oxcam ARC could be using the local authorities to leverage in that money in municipal green bonds. Isn't that a good idea?
Right, so hold that thought, please, David. By the way, we won't make David responsible for anything any government's ever said or done.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Because, and we are getting some questions now here, but you're next, sir, and then we're going to add in these ones. By the way, do remember to preference the questions as they come in, because then I know which ones you're most interested in. Yes, sir.
Question to Douglas. The question was raised whether the ARC, investment in the ARC and the success of the ARC, would benefit the rest of the UK. Has investment in Boston benefited the rest of the US?
Yeah. And maybe there's an even refined version of that, which is, has it benefited the northeast of the US more generally? I particularly would like to hear what you think it's done for Connecticut, for example. Other people in the room? Don't be shy. This is the one moment. Yes, madam. Mike's coming to you.
feel uncomfortable. That's my second question today. Maybe a short question, maybe for Barbara. You were talking about cluster. I didn't hear today anything about incubators, corporate accelerator, growing phenomenon. I was born in Israel, mentioned a few times here in the discussion. One of the great programs in Israel is the incubation that's still going on. It's been 30 years now, and it's evolving in very good positive trajectory. So that was one of the key success, the consistency in policy. So just a few words in reflection about incubators, corporate accelerators and accelerators.
Yeah, so we at Catapults, we talk about incubators, accelerators, and demonstrators being our key tools. Is there a question for Tim? Because if not, I'm going to ask him a really nasty one. Right, yes, madam. Microphone coming to you. So what we'll do is we'll take all of these questions that you've asked out loud here, and as you've asked one per panelist, we'll do it that way. Then we'll come to the ones on Slido. Yes.
Thank you. So Sarah Thorley from Savills. I know you talked a little bit, Tim, around kind of Europe and the connections with sort of other clusters. I'd be interested to know how you feel the UK could be better connecting into the wider European ecosystem. We advise quite a lot of clients on EMEA strategies into life sciences, and I think there's currently a real sort of desire to work out how the UK can be better interacting with some of those interesting growth corridors and how we can be attracting occupiers that work across all of those different environments.
Great question. Thank you very much. Let's deal with these ones first and make it nice and easy. So, David, you were sort of asked the question, how does all of this link to financial innovation around net zero? But maybe there's a bigger question here, which is, why is the innovation agenda and the sustainability agenda somehow not more intimately linked?
Yeah, and it was a very fair criticism that we hadn't covered the net zero angle. And of course, actually, although I'm not a member of the government, I have to say Kwasi Kwarteng absolutely embodies this. Kwasi, having been the energy minister before he became the Secretary of State, is very focused on net zero. I think it's been, and we've actually at Resolution Foundation just literally today bringing out a report on the whole issue of green jobs. What are these jobs like? And obviously there is some good news, which is when you're doing things like retrofitting homes to ensure they are more energy efficient, that is inherently a geographically well spread activity. It's a leveling up type program. Looking back, what I regret as a failure of innovation policy, including in my time when I was in government, when I have to take some responsibility for what happened then, is when you look at all the work that was done in DEC as it was on contracts for difference and offshore wind and identifying offshore wind as a great UK strategic asset. And we've ended up creating a very successful global Danish company, Ørsted. And we do some of the supply chain, and typically for Britain, we've got incredibly smart science, ensuring designing the sensors on the tips of the turbine blades, a very smart software to angle them. But the big integrating prime is Danish. And I had this conversation with friends of mine in the Treasury, and the Treasury who were then, and they may be getting better, purists against industrial strategy. One of them admitted to me, we never even thought from the angle of promoting UK suppliers. They were so focused on the economic elegance of their contracts for difference. So that's where we break down. And part of the reason for the success of Ørsted, of course, was it had some public money behind it, not just private money. So it had a greater appetite from risk than any competing UK suppliers. So I don't know about municipal green bonds, they could help, but a willingness to link the green agenda with industrial and innovation policy better in the future than we have in the past is certainly a challenge.
Great, that's a very helpful question.
Yeah, I'll also say that it hasn't been brought up a lot today because most of the developers are already beginning to do it and think about it. And that's done because demand is requiring it. The tenants in the market are requiring green buildings, net zero buildings. And so as a developer, all right, that's what we got to deliver. That's what we're going to do. So it's almost, the good news is it's already being worked up and it's already thought about. And it's almost not a forgotten issue, but we don't need to talk about it this year because we have to do it.
Yeah, you're doing it, and indeed in this country in particular, the real estate community on the whole is further ahead,
Way ahead.
than policy.
Way ahead. You didn't have Donald for 4 years. We did, so we're behind.
Yeah. And there's a great part in the question, though, that you've asked, which is about the UK as a financial innovation centre and how we leverage our financial innovation, particularly on carbon and climate. That's not today's conversation, but it's a very important point. But Douglas, the question was asked to you. You gave the case study of Boston and you made all those big points around it. But do you see that in Boston and in other North American clusters that the benefits are more widely distributed, or are the benefits very concentrated?
So it's the pandemic really kind of sped along that. We've talked about manufacturing a little bit today, and if you looked at Tim's map, right, his of Boston, you had Boston as the core, then he had 128 corridor, and now that's actually, you're seeing there's another ring road called 495, and that actually, you're seeing a lot of the manufacturing, because it goes to Orlando, is a little less expensive, and the skills are not blue coats or white coats, but the blue collar. And so we're actually seeing it more from New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine for people to come down to do manufacturing jobs. And we have a project in Andover, Massachusetts, which is 10 minutes from the New Hampshire border. And we have 2 big manufacturing sites there, and that's the reason why. And they chose it because of the blue collar New Hampshire workforce. Connecticut is a New York suburb and a Boston suburb. It's fine.
So what you're saying in geographical terms, just to get this right, is that this would be like the Golden Triangle or the Greater Southeast combining with the East and the West Midlands of England to create a big cluster at that scale, where you've got jobs in production, technical jobs at every level of the income and the skills.
Because they want to drive there. If there's an incident, they don't want to have to get on a plane again. Because if they couldn't come to China, they couldn't go to India if there was a problem. They want to get in their car and drive 45 minutes to an hour.
Great. Thank you very much. Barbara, you were asked the question about how important incubators are, and it would be good to hear what you think about that, and in a sense, to align that with whether you need incubation at every point of the cycle in any industry's clusterization, or whether it plays particular roles at certain points.
Okay, so it was a missed point, to be honest. I should have mentioned the fact that one of the key activities in our clusters is business support, which includes the incubation and also the acceleration and scale-up activity. In fact, our clusters are made of a mixed range of companies, so mixed sizes, so from the 1 or 2 people's companies to large corporates. So the beginning, obviously, incubation is extremely important in the growth cycle. But what we've seen, just as our clusters are starting to mature, that there is an awful lot of demand, not just on that incubation stage, but actually the journey needs to be complete from incubation to acceleration, scale up, and now we've got even more demand on the scale up side. And my colleague Stuart Grant already mentioned the fact that the joint venture is thinking, it's actually in the process of investing into those type of facilities for all the clusters. We've got quite a lot of incubation capability in the space cluster, which was the first cluster we developed on our campus. We've got some incubation capability in other clusters like the energy, the health, and they are distributed across our partners within the clusters. So it's not just UKRI, STSC that is providing those incubation activities, but actually it's the Catapult that is based with us, is other institutes like the Rosalind Franklin currently is thinking of developing incubation space for companies that want to come alongside them and do research and incubate their activities there. So there is an approach across the campus and across our clusters, which is increasing. And that is becoming even more important at the moment, where we're seeing a lot of those companies graduating from the very, very small stage to scale up.
Barbara, it sounds like you're saying that the role that the incubators play is primarily about connecting the young firms and the entrepreneurs into the ecosystem of the cluster it's not so much teaching them how to run a business, to put it at its most simple. Is that right?
It's a bit of both, I think. Depends on the maturity of the incubator. For example, the ESA business incubator on the Harvard campus is actually both, a bit of both. So they are both supporting and introducing the companies into the ecosystem, but at the same time, they're actually teaching how to run a business as well. So they're giving the whole range of business support, licensing, IP advice, and all of that, and also how to engage, in the business side of creating a business. Because very often when you've got the inventor, they focus very much on the technology, but they actually then haven't got a focus on how to run that business. So all of that, and we work very closely with the Catapult, the Satellite Applications Catapult as well. So there is a full chain of actions that is happening on campus, but the incubators, I think, play a big part in all of that. But then when the companies graduate after they grow to, 5 people or a little bit more, obviously it's not a place for them to be in an incubator. No. So they start going into an accelerator area where they start growing really fast in terms of office space as well. They need shared labs. So that's where STSC comes into it, and other organizations on campus like the MRC or the public sector organizations working in that sphere. So it's incubation up to a certain point of growth, like 10, 20 maximum, and then they scale up after that. And then they start interfacing with a different range of services.
Great, very, very clear. And it goes without saying almost that in supporting the growth of the cluster, you've got to support the individual firms. You've also got to support the clustering process. Tim, you were asked a very good question about European linkages. And of course, David's already made the point that we've got the Plan A, Plan B model, on horizon. That debate's going. But what are the places in Europe and what are the modes of connection and collaboration that you think are most important for the UK's innovation locations?
Well, I think it's a really good question, and I do think there's a few different formats or models that you see. For example, you see increasingly district-to-district relationships that are emerging. Imperial West in White City building the relationship with 22@ in Barcelona, and those sorts of relationships being much more oriented around the universities primarily. Then you might have a model, for example, the city of Oslo and its relationship with the local government of Hackney. And that's been about an 8 or 9 year innovation startup connectivity relationship that's gone very successfully. And even ones that are more led and convened through city regional mayors, Liverpool to Dublin, for example. Different models through which those are convened tend to rely a lot on city government or public appetite and leadership, and also a willingness to operate in an agile way in terms of scale. But I think there's a lot to look into there, and it can grow. A very quick additional point, which is to say, one of the things that came out from our experience, Greg, working and thinking about what's going on around the whole of the UK, is that people have said, actually, when it comes to incubation, when it comes to sort of networking and capacity building, one of the biggest gaps we tend to have in specific locations is dedicated capacity on individuals who act as brokers, who act as bridge builders, who are, have the biggest address books and are empowered and enabled to connect people of different backgrounds to each other, and to do that in a focused, serious way. It's often neglected in terms of what money is spent on, but it really needs to happen more.
Tim, I'm going to ask you one more question, because I know you've just completed a piece of work looking at the potential for the 3 innovation accelerators identified in the Levelling Up white paper, Greater Glasgow, Greater Manchester, the West Midlands. Are there particular places around the world that you think have lessons for those locations, where, if you like, we're not already a mature innovation ecosystem, although I think Manchester and Glasgow and the West Midlands in their own way would argue that they are. But are there other places around the world that are particularly relevant for them?
Sure. I mean, I think in North America, you'd have to say Philadelphia is the example of the turnaround post-industrial city that's really achieved in terms of life sciences and other leading sectors a scale of growth that was much beyond what was anticipated, but also developed a much more deliberate approach to inclusive innovation. The universities are really dialed into how to use procurement, how to use their educational capacity to serve a much wider basin of people. So that would be one example. And then I'd look east as well. I think, the Korean secondary cities have done much better in recent decades, relatively speaking. Busan, for example, the Northeast Asia's capital of film and culture now in a way that people would not have perceived. And there's been a lot of efforts to combine smart infrastructure, metropolitan governance, and deliberate cluster building to good effect. So I think there's different kinds of ways you learn from both sides of the world, really.
Great, thank you very much. So, panel, we're nearly at time, but there's a couple of questions we want to answer. David, this question in the middle here, what do you think the real estate industry lacks when investing in R&D related real estate? It's quick answers, please. And then, Douglas, there was one question. Can we see the rest of the questions? Can we go up to the other ones? There was one more, which is about metrics, which will come back to science parks. Douglas, can you pick up on science parks? Barbara, can you tackle, is there sufficient funding in the UK compared to the rest of the world? And then, Tim, I'll ask you to lead the conversation off on metrics. So, David, what do you think? Anything that the real estate community particularly should learn about investing in R&D?
Yeah, and I think the real estate community can help with a real weakness in the British offer at the moment, which is international investors, especially sovereign wealth funds, from Norway to Mubadala. They're excited about the British research base and don't quite know how to invest in it. Packaging up an asset that can be, where the fantastic Jerry Grimstone, a really energetic minister in this space, gets calls all the time from these people who are excited about British R&D and don't quite know how they can invest in it. The retail sector, and it links to the other question on science parks, something that packages them in an investable proposition for overseas funds. Very useful.
Thank you very much. Douglas, in your experience, what is the role of science parks in collaborating for regional or sector clusters, and how can they be encouraged?
Yeah, I think science parks have a key role in the sense that, you look at the Cambridge Science Park, it was the first one in the country that really kind of springboard the whole life science platform. I think the concept of kind of open innovation and being completely transparent, I think is probably very important. And so, the companies on the park are, they're not going to share their research because they're going to be, that's their bread and butter, but they're open to talk and open to set up collaborations and partnerships. So I think setting up the environment and collision points to allow that to happen is really what the science park should be doing, and talking to each other and trying to make that happen.
Thank you so much. Brilliant, succinct answer. Barbara, I don't know if you can answer the question about whether there's enough financing for life sciences, but what's your best guess?
My best guess, probably not, but I think that now there is more and more focus on the private sector, so leveraging what we've got from the public sector in a much better way than we used to do before. And because of the activities, the increased life sciences activities in the UK, we're seeing actually also first-hand experience with Harwell and the other campus in the Northwest. We're seeing much more interest from inward investors, very large corporates coming to the UK. That will bring much more investment. Now, what I would like to see is that we work together to actually leverage that investment in an intelligent way, so that we can do much more than what we can do if we work separately. A little bit also back to your point about connecting things together. There are so many science parks, there are so many campuses, so many clusters in the life sciences sector around the UK. Let's connect them together. Let's actually find better ways of doing business together.
And it links to what David said about scaling up the investment opportunity. Tim, you're going to lead off the answer to the final question, which is, how will we know when we've got a scientific superpower? A couple of metrics from you, and then one metric each from the panel, and then we'll close, and I'll invite Tim back to the stage, right?
Well, I think the aggregate metrics of science and innovation are relatively well understood. I think it's more the question of, how well distributed, and also how, to what extent does this deliver place and sustainability success. Those broader innovation equal to prosperity metrics, I think, are going to become more and more decisive. We see this happening at a local level, but it should be looked at how many places across the whole of the UK have really reached world-class innovation output or outcomes, but also delivered and in effect translated that to local benefits. I think that would be the way that we want to go. And we want to look also internationally at comparison. I think we don't just want to judge it on its own terms. We want to look at what are the other 10 or 15 leading regions and countries in the world doing, how we compete and compare to them. That's the real battle.
And you've done some very interesting work on what we might call the second tier, or the second division of innovation locations. David, what would you add? How will we know if we've got there?
I have to say, I know it's a very classic measure, but rates of patenting, doing better, it is not a British strength at the moment. Doing much better on that would be an indication we are being better at commercializing our research.
Great. Barbara, what's the one key measure that would tell you that we've got there?
Inward investment. Because, again, I repeat that, but I see it happening actually across all of our sectors at the moment. So in life sciences, after COVID, immediate big investments from the life sciences sector, and big eyes from big investors, inward investors from outside the UK.
And I guess it's share of global inward investment, not just quantum, right?
Yeah, of course. Yes.
Good. Douglas, what's your one key measure?
I was going to be lazy and say when rents in Oxford and Cambridge break 100 pounds a square foot, but that's just too lazy.
I won't get them to vote.
Yeah, but realistically, I think building on what Michael Anstey said last time on the last panel, when we actually have a company, a UK-born and bred company, going over to Boston and buying Boston companies and bringing that IP over here, that to me is really when you're really, watch out because here we come.
It's outward investment, not just inward investment. Okay,
Good.
Brilliant. Let's thank the panel. Thank you very much, panel. Thank you. Let's have one final vote. Now, you walked in here this morning at 9 a.m. Are you leaving more confident or less confident that we know how to create a scientific superpower in the UK? If you're more confident, raise your hands. Okay, if you're less confident, raise your hands. Wow. Okay, well, conference agenda achieved. Tim, over to you to close the event.